My students are always making these 6 mistakes. Are you making them too? Stick around to find out. Hello everyone, my name's Phil and welcome to the IELTS Grind. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you're watching for the first time and give us a like. So, I'm going to be talking about 6 common grammar mistakes that my students always make, and I am correcting at least 20 essays every single week, and I always see these errors. So let's go through them. The first one is all to do with modal verbs. Well, what's a modal verb, you say? Well, a modal verb is something like must, can, should, would, will, ought to, etc. So they have different meanings and we use them in a different way, but they have a very common grammatical structure. So what I'm going to do is to read you some examples. Can you pick out the error that my students always make? So my first example is, I must visit my mother-in-law today. I must visit my mother-in-law today. So remember that this sentence has a mistake in it, so you shouldn't be copying everything. But what is the mistake? My second example is, people should can choose when they start work. People should can choose when they start work. What's the mistake? Can you spot it? And the last one, I ought to eat less sugar. I ought to eat less sugar. What's the mistake there? Is there a mistake? So, let's go through it. So the biggest error that a lot of my students make is that they often include the infinitive of a verb after the modal. What do I mean by infinitive? Well, the infinitive is when you have the verb part of a verb and the to. So to eat, to go, to say, for example. Now, after verbs like must, should, can, will, would, we don't need to follow it with to. So I would say, I should go, I will eat, I might say, for example, not I would to go. So that is a common mistake that we make. However, there are some modal verbs which include to. For example, ought to. If you don't know what ought to means, it's used in a very similar way to should. So I should stop smoking. I ought to stop smoking. It means the same thing. So we have ought to, need to, for example. Now the to in this is not part of the next verb. So I ought to stop. The to is not part of to smoke. It's actually part of the modal verb ought to. They always go together. Yeah? So this is a common mistake that my students make. And if you're making this mistake, then you could be costing yourself a lot of points in the IELTS, especially for speaking, grammar in speaking and in writing. So another common mistake that my students make is all to do with prepositions and the verb that follows them. So let me give you some examples. In spite of study every day, he didn't pass the exam. In spite of study every day, he didn't pass the exam. What's the error there? Listen to my next example. I did think about go to the park, but then it rained. I did think about go to the park, but then it rained. What's the error in that sentence? And my last example for you. He has a knack for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He has a knack for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. What is the problem here? Well, if we go through in each example, the problem is that the verb after the preposition is in the wrong form. So instead of, in spite of study every day, he didn't pass the exam, we should say, in spite of studying every day, he didn't pass the exam. So the reason why we have studying is because of the preposition of. It's not of study, it's of studying. Okay. In the same way, I did think about go. It should be, I did think about going to the park, but then it rained. So because we have about, the next verb follows ing in this example. And then in my last example, he has a knack for be in the wrong place. It should be, he has a knack for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And again, it's because it follows for. We don't say be, we say being, the ing. It's often called the gerund as well. So another issue that I have, and this is a little bit more of an advanced structure, so it's understandable that a lower level student might make this error. But again, we're staying with the idea of using ing verbs or gerunds, and it's when we use them as a subject. So let me read you my examples. Can you tell me what the problem is? Being a confident person who has no fear, making him very attractive. My next example is studying every day, it will make you better at English. Studying every day, it will make you better at English. What's the problem with this example? And finally, doing something you don't want to do, you will be unhappy. Doing something you don't want to do, you will be unhappy. Doing something you don't want to do, you will be unhappy. Okay, so did you spot the problems in those three examples? So we are starting each example with an ing verb as a subject, and this is important to remember. So if we take the first example, being a confident person who has no fear, this is exactly the same as saying he or it. It's a subject. All of that is a subject. So we could replace it with he, she, I, we, they, okay? Or a noun, for example. So that means that the next verb, making him very attractive, we need to change the conjugation. Not making, but makes. So being a confident person who has no fear makes him attractive. It makes him attractive. That's what we're saying here. In the next example, studying every day, it will make you better at English. Again, studying every day is the same as it. So we don't have to say it again. So studying every day will make you better at English. So again, it's the same error. It's putting a subject and another subject, or not putting the right form of the verb. In my last example, doing something you don't want to do, you will be unhappy. We might say, doing something that you don't want to do will make you unhappy. So we don't need to put you, because doing something that you don't like is the same as you or he or she. It's another subject. So this is a common error when we use gerunds or ing verbs as a subject and then not conjugating the verb correctly. So let's move on to the next common mistake that my students make. So the next common mistake is using every or any, and this is very confusing. So let me give you some examples, and can you tell me what the problem is here? So, every person have to learn from their own mistakes. Every person have to learn from their own mistake. Every person have to learn from their own mistakes. So, did you hear the problem there? Let's move on to the next one. Any time are a good time for chocolate. Any time are a good time for chocolate. Did you hear the mistake? Write it down. And my third example. Every cars make a certain amount of pollution. Every cars make a certain amount of pollution. Okay, so what's the problem here? Well, although we're saying every person, every car, any time, we're not talking about all people, or all of the time, or all cars. What we're saying is that if we take the group, we're looking at one example of that thing, and we're talking about, yes, the entire group, but through a singular example, which makes the grammar a little bit different. So instead of saying every person have to, it should be every person has to, because it's a person. He, she, he has, she has. So in my example, we should say every person has to learn from their own mistakes. Now, this is a little bit different, because with the part where I say there, this is a bit of I don't know, it's a common mistake that native speakers make, and it's because nowadays we don't want to say he or she, and often we don't know if the person is male or female. So instead of saying every person has to learn from his mistakes, which we may have said in the past. We now say their mistakes because it means a man and a woman. So it's a grammatical error, but we actually use it in common usage. So you're going to hear that quite a lot. The next example was any time are a good time for chocolate. It should be any time is a good time for chocolate, because we're talking about, you know, a minute or a particular time in the singular rather than all time through history. And my last example was every cars make a certain amount of pollution. It should be every car makes a certain amount of pollution. So again, we're talking about the verb in the singular. So every car rather than every cars. If we wanted to talk about every single car in the world, we would say all cars make a certain amount of pollution. And on to the last common mistake that my students always make, and if you're making these mistakes, then you could also benefit from this video and other videos, so don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And if you have any questions at all or any errors that you make that you'd like me to explain, don't forget to leave a comment. So the last mistake is with most of. So listen to this example and can you tell me what the mistake is? Most of the people like to have time off at the weekend. Most of the people like to have time off at the weekend. Okay, what's the error there? Why is that not 100% correct? Most of the students don't study enough. Most of the students don't study enough. Now, grammatically, this is correct, but it means something else to what the writer meant. So what's the error? What's the message that we're giving with this example? And listen to the difference with this. Most of the students in the group don't understand this rule. Most of the students in the group don't understand this rule. What's the difference between this one and the previous example? Okay, so of course the difference here is most of the versus most. So if we say most of the people like to have time off at the weekend, it doesn't make sense because we want to talk about, you know, in general, all people. So we would say most people. Most people like to have time off at the weekend. It's a general fact. When we use most of the, because we're using the, which is the definite article, we're referring to a particular group. So if you said most of the people in my family like to have time off that weekend, that would be correct because we're talking about a smaller group within the entire population. So when we say most of the, this is really important for your task 1 writing in particular. So most of the industries saw an increase. This would be a particular example from that group. But if you wanted to talk about general facts, you would say most industries in 2008 saw an increase in profits, for example. Okay. So my students make these 6 errors all the time and I'm forever correcting them. And it's just shooting them in the foot because they are such simple ideas to correct. And if you're making these mistakes, then you should focus on them and make sure that you don't make these mistakes when you take your IELTS exam. Okay, so don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and if you have any questions for me or for Michael, then we will be happy to answer your queries. I will see you again in a future video. Thanks very much for watching. See you later.